Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us on today's panel discussion webinar, Prevent an SBOM F-Bomb, Streamlining Compliance in Your Software Supply Chain, brought to you by the IT Forum. I'm Kelly Vick, the host of the program, and it's my pleasure to welcome today's speakers. Our moderator is Colin Whitaker. Colin is the founder and director of Informed Risk Decisions. He has over 30 years experience in cybersecurity, and he currently provides cybersecurity risk consultancy services to a wide range of public and private companies. Colin has presented on information security at major events around the world and has published a number of papers on security. And on the panel, welcome Paul Asadorian, Principal Security Evangelist for Eclipsium and the founder of the Security Weekly podcast. Charlie Jones, Director of Product Management at Reversing Labs. Brian Fox, Co-founder and CTO of Sonatype. And Andrew Dormany, GRC Specialist and Solutions Engineer at OneTrust. We'll get into introductions in a moment, but first, a short housekeeping video. We'll be right back after this.
The IT Forum, educational content for governance, risk management, and compliance professionals. A forum for thought leaders to address today's GRC and IT security topics.
Taking that threat intelligence and using that as an overlay in your existing systems becomes really important.
There is a big difference in service providers versus other third parties that you might be providing data to.
But it highlights organizations' lack of preparedness for situations like this.
Here are some housekeeping notes to be aware of. This webcast is interactive and we want your questions. Please submit these at any time using the Questions tab, and we'll address as many of these as possible during the webinar. We've also lined up some polls to get your input, and we'll notify you when these are active. Please be ready to submit your response when prompted by using the box below your console. Just make sure the slides are not in full screen mode, or you will not see the options. Make sure you check out our supporting resources in the Attachments tab, as we've uploaded some great content for you today. We want to hear from you, so don't forget to leave your feedback and comments. We take feedback seriously, and it helps us plan for future programs. This webinar is approved by NASBA. To qualify for CPE credit, you must demonstrate participation by attending the full session, responding to the polls, and by rating us at the end. Certificates will be issued within 7 days from our learning management system, the IT CPE Academy. So please watch out for the email notification and check your spam folder if that doesn't come through. After the live presentation, this webcast will be available on demand. So please share with any colleagues who you think will be interested in the topic. And now, let's get started.
Okay, so on today's webinar, we'll explore the critical requirements of PCI DSS 4.0 and other industry standards, provide a comprehensive overview of Executive Order 14208 and OMB Memo 2218 and how these directives impact software supply chain compliance. Highlight effective tools and techniques to streamline compliance processes, and share practical examples of successful compliance management in various industries, including how to overcome common challenges and implement effective solutions. Moving on to the agenda. We'll begin with speaker introductions before running over some quick tips recommended by our panel, and then we'll dive into the Q&A discussion facilitated by Colin before closing with takeaways and further information at the end. So now, without further ado, I'll pass the program over to you, Colin.
Thank you very much indeed, Kelly, and good afternoon, everyone. As Kelly mentioned, we're going to start off by running around our virtual table here. We're going to hear from each of our panelists. I'm going to invite them to tell us a little bit about themselves and a little about their organizations. So everyone listening today, or whoever downloads it later from the archives, can better understand the frame of reference for this afternoon's conversation from the panelists bring to this conversation. I'm going to start with yourself, Brian. Thank you for joining us. Good afternoon. Can you tell us about yourself and the work you're doing there at Sonatype?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. So background on me, former developer, been involved in open source for a very long time. I'm a member of the Apache Software Foundation. I was the chair of the Apache Maven project for a number of years. I'm currently a board member of the OpenSSF, also involved in Eclipse and several other foundations. I spend a lot of time more recently working in the policy sector as more governments have become interested in open source usage. Sonatype, we were early, one of the first companies doing software composition analysis, repository management. We also run the Maven Central repository, which everybody in the world doing Java, you're downloading those components from a repository that Sonatype manages. And that provides us really unique visibility into what's going on in the ecosystem that we use to build platforms to help enterprises manage their dependencies, with highly accurate data, defense against new rising threats like intentionally malicious components and malware, all focused on solving this problem at enterprise scale.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Brian, and very relevant for the conversation this afternoon. So thanks for joining us. So we move on to Andrew. Andrew, good afternoon and welcome. Tell us about yourself and the work you're doing at OneTrust.
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Dormany. I'm a solution engineer here at OneTrust. And I've been at OneTrust for around 3 years now. Prior to OneTrust, I was in the risk advisory practice at EY. So both roles involve talking to customers almost every day, understanding current pain points, blockers, new visions for GRC programs. I really enjoy problem solving for all the business use cases out there and how we're able to support with our software. I've also spent time in the Army as a Black Hawk helicopter crew chief, risk always being assessed there as well. So I spend a lot more time talking about compliance and supplier risk than tactical operation risk these days, but all falls under the same umbrella. So to introduce OneTrust, we're a SaaS-based platform, primarily operating in privacy and GRC management spaces. The solutions closely related to today's conversation will be these listed here. So the primary workspace is third-party management. Here we're tracking third parties across the organization, aggregating data to create a single pane of glass viewpoint around a third party, a vendor, et cetera, directly assessing vendors using the platform, and overall facilitating security evaluations, utilizing a life cycle around that vendor. So two supplementary areas that we'll talk about today as well are the due diligence and the exchange elements. These are supplemental areas that can layer on additional data from premier agencies out in the market that really help aggregate into a visible or a meaningful format, Dow Jones, security scorecard, risk recon, et cetera. It just really gives a greater insight into your vendor population. So excited to be here today.
Brilliant, Andrew. Thank you very much. And the last one's very relevant to understanding how our supply chain's operating. So thank you for that. We'll move on to Charlie. Welcome, Charlie. Thanks for joining us. Tell us about yourself and the work you're doing at Reversing Labs.
Yeah, thanks for having me back again, Colin. I am a director of product management at Reversing Labs. I specifically oversee our software supply chain security product called Spectra Assure. Despite my American accent coming through, I'm actually based out of London, where I've been for almost the last 6 years now, which is crazy to think about. I am a very active member of the security community, both in the UK and back in the States as well. So here in the UK, I sit on the technical advisory panel of the UK Cybersecurity Council. So I kind of help advise on emerging best practices and as well as kind of define certification pathways for cyber professionals in the UK. And then within the US, you'll see me kind of active in a number of industry working groups covering software supply chain security and SBOM more broadly. And then previously to Reversing Labs, I ran the supply chain security proposition at PwC in the UK. So worked with various kind of Fortune FTSE 100 organizations, predominantly in the financial service space, to design and operationalize very large kind of third-party risk management programs. Enough about me. Let's talk about Reversing Labs. Our history dates almost 15 years now, where we really originated as an organization who did malware analysis and threat hunting. And interestingly, after supporting a number of our customers kind of solve those use cases, our research team began noticing this flurry of kind of malware and targeted attacks that were no longer really originating from single files that companies would interact with through cloud storage, email, internet, but they were propagating through much larger digital objects like commercial software packages and containers. So we evolved our offering to introduce this new software supply chain security capability that takes our kind of battle-tested binary analysis engine that we previously leveraged to analyze single files, and now we use it to recursively unpack and analyze the contents of of very large commercial software packages. And because we operate kind of at the binary package level rather than the source code level, it can be used by both publishers of software, those organizations who want to make sure their product's safe in its final state before they ship it. But we can also help enterprise buyers of software, where you can take that kind of full commercial off-the-shelf package that you may download from a vendor website and upload it to our platform for analysis. And as we deconstruct that software, yes, we'll give it to you in a very neat bill of materials. But as we know, I'm sure we'll talk about today, an SBOM only takes you part of the way, right? It tells you what's in your software, not necessarily whether it presents risk to your business. So we take it a step further and analyze various aspects of that package, which we know malicious actors target in an attack. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see those characteristics we look for when analyzing software: embedded malicious components, evidence of tampering through digital signature manipulation or suspicious behaviors that are inserted during releases, vulnerabilities, hardening practices, and finally things like unintentionally leaked secrets or compliance issues. And we perform all those tests with the ultimate goal of understanding, can you trust the software that you purchase or that you buy and publish to your customers?
Brilliant, Charlie. Thank you very much. And all very relevant for this afternoon's conversation. So thank you for that. Finally, move on to Paul. Paul, welcome back. Tell us about yourself and the work you're doing at Eclipsium, Paul.
Sure. Thanks, Colin. I'm Paul Sidorian. I'm the principal security evangelist for Eclipsium. It is kind of a strange title, but I wear a lot of hats. I get involved in some research things, some of our threat detection analysis I'm involved in, as well as being involved in marketing and spending time with the community. I founded the Security Weekly podcast network in 2005 and do 2 podcasts, both Paul Security Weekly and Eclipsium's Below the Surface podcasts, where I have the pleasure of speaking to amazing guests, which is awesome. I do like firmware hacking. I've always had this affinity towards firmware. And while a lot of what we do at Eclipsium is firmware based, we branch out into other areas as well. So what we do at Eclipsium is infrastructure supply chain security. I also like to term that as everything below the operating system, in applying both, supply chain aspects as well as security detections and preventions for all those things that in your infrastructure likely you didn't really choose, right? You may choose the operating system and your applications that come on your computers, but you didn't necessarily choose the software and firmware that lives on the actual chips, components, processors, and boot firmware. And so that's what we do. We allow you visibility into that layer to protect the foundation of the system.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Paul. I think everyone appreciates, we couldn't get a better group of people to talk about the whole issue of SBOMs and everything that comes along with it and how we manage the supply chain security. So thanks very much indeed for that. We're now going to go on to what Kelly mentioned was the quick tips. And we'll come back to some of these issues in a moment. The quick tips we've asked them to generate, these are really about issues to get your thoughts going in the conversation that we're having this afternoon. They're all about, the first one's about why you need SBOMs in the first place and what they are. Supplementing supply chain security with risk rating agency scores, how you can do binary analysis, which provides visibility into software risks, and how you can, how it's very important to update your firmware. So I'll come into, I'll bring each of our panelists in to tell you a little bit about those as we're going through it. So Brian, I'm going to start with yourself. SBOMs as a phrase, software bill of materials, for those people who may not be familiar with it, they've increased in importance significantly over the last couple of years. Why is that the case?
Yeah, so, the challenge is that analyzing software and understanding the dependencies, while this is something that we've done for like 12 years, is difficult in compiled native code in certain cases. And so like the previous was talking about there, like the below the fold, all the things you didn't choose. And so, while it's possible and fairly straightforward today to generate bill of materials for all of the dependencies in your first party applications, when you're delivering that, downstream to one of your customers, they're going to expect visibility of the entire stack, and some of the stuff, think databases, application servers, these types of things. And so the SBOMs become important to complete the story. and to provide some additional visibility. In an ideal world, you wouldn't have to do any analysis of the third-party stuff. We're not anywhere near that ideal world, but as you can see here, a lot of the regulations are kind of driving people in that direction. So you're going to need to be able to produce SBOMs to your customers if you fall into one of these categories. Next year, payment card PCI standards are going to require it. The CRA in European Union is gearing up to require that. NIS2 for digital services in Europe, DORA for financial industries, the FDC, FDA requires it already. You can't even start medical device approval if you don't have an SBOM as part of your application. The CISA attestation form requires this for federal government sales, or if you're developing as a contractor, or basically if any of your customers fall into one of these categories, they're kind of going to be asking for the same level of visibility. So the net of this is pretty quickly, everybody's going to be expected to be able to provide an accurate software bill of materials for the software they're providing to their customers.
Yeah, and I think I'd also add that one of the things you're going to need them is you're going to need to prove the negatives, all the positives. I mean, with some vulnerabilities that we've had recently, which are buried in some of the code, which you couldn't necessarily be familiar with, the only way you're getting visibility is by an SBOM. I mean, Log4j is a classic example. People wouldn't have discovered that if they didn't have an SBOM and wouldn't be able to prove that they weren't affected if they didn't have an SBOM capable of doing that. So I think this is going to become important for everyone to answer those sort of questions they're asked in the future. So thanks for that, Brian. I think that's really set the stage with that tip of why we're heading down this direction. Andrew, from your perspective, I mean, you noted the importance of risk rating agencies, but why do you think they're so important in the respect of software supply chain assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is an excellent segue from just the previous tip, because we're seeing our customers taking on more and more responsibility because of the increased regulation. We're becoming a lot tighter, and how we should be observing a lot of the vendor risk and the different angles in which you can receive an attack and whatnot. And so we're seeing a lot of that burden being placed on just day-to-day operators as they're trying to properly assess and understand the risk that lies within their supply chain or their vendors. And so these risks are primarily uncovered through risk assessments that continues today. We're moving into an era of automation and leveraging as much functionality as we can to reduce the manual type of exercises to find this information. And so really what we're seeing recently is a large uptick in the amount of supplementary data that you can use during your evaluation process. And that data comes from, again, these risk rating agencies. And so OneTrust is not only a place where you can aggregate the information about your vendor, your supplier, your third party, but also layer on additional insight from these agencies out there. I name dropped a few earlier, but these being able to supplement the data that you already have collected directly from that third party. So it's not necessarily a replacement activity. We're always moving in that direction, but it's certainly good insight to narrow the focal point of how a supplier should be properly assessed. A lot of the times these scores that you're receiving will give you insights into issues that a supplier's had in the past, or just a vision of the supplier from the public perception. And it gives you a more narrow focus point to be able to assess that vendor, that third party, the supplier, in a way that gives you more detailed information and is directly related to the way you're going to be using that supplier in your internal operations. And so again, we've partnered with several out in the market. We'd like to provide that insight directly through the platform, and that insight can be leveraged in automation rules, monitoring techniques, really making the day-to-day life easier of these individuals at companies who are responsible for understanding the risk and why it occurs. And so layering on that supplemental data to your day-to-day activities can really help just give you a full comprehensive understanding.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Andrew. Charlie, your reversing labs, you can go as deep as you want to in the code with your tools and technology, but how deep would you recommend that other people go to?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. I think traditionally people haven't had a lot of choice, right? It's from the buyer side of the equation. I know Brian talked about it before. We're now in this age where buyers are expecting visibility into software, and traditionally they haven't had that visibility. They're forced to kind of inherently trust their vendor inherently trust that their vendor is using secure development practices. And that's for kind of a number of reasons. I have them listed on the left of common barriers they faced previously. We don't need to go through all of them, but things like maybe you didn't have the right to audit. That wasn't present in a software vendor contract that's traditionally structured like a end user licensing agreement or a shrink wrap agreement, right? The click here to accept the terms. Also, you had these kind of traditional methods that are used to oversee vendors and the notorious kind of security questionnaire, right? Which doesn't really provide a ton of true assurance because you're reliant on that vendor to provide kind of verbal attestation to tell you how secure they are. And sure, there's certainly no shortage of kind of technology out there to perform testing on software, but it likely required access to source code, something that you would have never gotten as an enterprise. So to your question, Colin, how deep can you go? Well, previously you couldn't. And now that's traditionally been the case. We're starting to see this kind of seismic shift in the way that third-party software risk is being managed, because now you have the emergence of this kind of new principle that's being put forward by CISA to reflect the current state of the market, which is called secure by demand. And it's kind of a follow-on to the secure by design and secure by default concepts. And if you're not familiar, essentially it represents this increased demand into the transparency of the makeup and security of third-party software from those organizations who rely on it every day. So my tip is really for those software buyers out there who are looking to overcome this need for transparency through the use of binary analysis, simply saying that so long as you have access to the actual software package that you consume and that you deploy in your environment, you can find out what's in it and you can understand whether it poses a risk to your organization. And that's so powerful because it allows you to essentially shed this dependency that you used to have on a supplier. So in short, the tip is you don't need source code to perform testing of software. As long as you have access to the binary, you can independently evaluate it yourself on your own time.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Steve, for that. And I think this is going to be a challenge for a lot of organizations going down that route. It will be very interesting to review in a couple of years' time to see what difference secure by demand has made on the marketplace and the stability and vulnerabilities within products. Thanks very much for that, Charlie. Paul, the issue here was update firmware. I think, and that's a no-brainer, but it must be an important issue for you to raise it as a tip here. Do you think we have forgotten to do that?
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations don't give a high enough priority to updating firmware and updating their infrastructure components. And I broke those out into, 3 different areas, right? So you've got BIOS and more commonly UEFI, and there's a lot of benefits to updating that, often to remediate the vulnerabilities that you have on your system below the operating system in UEFI. The answer is to update firmware, but that can come with, not always, with things like updating secure boot certificates or updating the microcode on your CPU. So there's multiple components that benefit from a UEFI update. Outside of UEFI updates, we have baseboard management controllers. These are systems that are built into and intertwined into your systems, running at the highest privilege level. That is a separate update package to keep that firmware up to date. And last but not least, we always see all of the attacks against network appliances, VPN appliances especially. Threat actors are kind of on a roll going after those in organizations. And despite what some might believe, those don't come from the vendor secure by default all the time. You have to apply updates and manage the security of those appliances, even though they come in that kind of pre-installed package for you.
Of those 3, I think they're all very relevant. But I actually think for most enterprises, that last one, network appliances, is a really important one because they're buying more and more network appliances because it's more of a commodity. And when you start to get into the commodity space, you expect it to be treated like white goods and therefore be secure by default, which it may not be. So no, I think that's a really important to stress that. So thank you for that. I think all of those tips set the conversation up very nicely for this afternoon's conversation. I think we're really on a roll here. We're going to pause on the slide with all our affiliations on it so that to remind everyone who's speaking and where we're coming from, which I think is important. I'd like to remind the audience, this is an interactive conversation. You are part of the conversation, and we welcome you being part of that conversation, because you will help stimulate us by some of the questions you ask, of which we've got already two, which I will try and feed into the conversation as we're going along. As many of you who've attended these webinars know, I like to set my own sort of context for it, because I haven't had the opportunity to do so yet. At the moment, I'm supporting a number of clients who are in the software development process themselves, particularly in the life sciences. And they are making particular attention to their own supply chain security, managing the vulnerabilities, generating SBOMs for their own clients to provide reassurance to them. And I think it's really important. But I think it's equally important, really, for the big commercial software suppliers to keep their own supply chain secure and manage their own dependencies. And I was regaling before I came on the call some of the issues I had with a major vendor of the global software around the world who isn't maintaining their dependencies the way perhaps they ought to, because it's impacting some of my clients. One of the key issues, though, with all of this is the importance that all the regulators are placing on this issue now, and the need to generate and so on. So what I'm going to try and do, and with the narrative for this conversation that we're going to have, I'm going to start off with some of the driving factors. I think we need to really get a head round why people are pushing us down this route for supply chain security. What's the rationale? Where are the driving factors? And some of those regulations that Brian was talking about earlier on. And then we'll walk up to look at some of the challenges and issues that are present in doing so, and some of the tips and recommendations on how to manage those compliances before we get looking into some of the issues in the future. So to kick things off, Brian, let's start at the beginning, some of the driving factors. Okay, so with the increasing complexity of the legislative mandates, such as the executive order you mentioned and the OMB memo that came out from it, where are organizations going to start on their journey to meet some of these compliance requirements?
Yeah, so organizations need to start with the ability to produce an accurate bill of materials for their own first-party software, right? Nobody's going to produce a bill of materials for the stuff that you ship. You need to start there. Tools, technologies exist to do the analysis, the binary analysis, the manifest analysis, depending on the ecosystems, to produce an accurate bill of materials. That has largely been a solved problem for a very long time, but not enough organizations are doing it, as evidenced by sort of the collective freak out when Log4Shell happened. So many organizations literally had no idea what their own dependencies were in their applications. And I talked to organizations that took 6 months or more just to triage where applications might be affected, as contrasted by, customers that had the portfolio rolled out, that they were able to remediate within days because they already knew where they were using Log4j. Those teams were directly alerted that they had this problem and they knew what to do. There was basically no drama. Those companies got to have Christmas that year. Many others missed Christmas and New Year's and a bunch of other holidays trying to deal with this. And the sad reality is, as we sit here right now today, we're almost 3 years post Log4Shell. And I can tell you for a fact that 30% of the versions of Log4j that are being downloaded every day today are of those versions that are affected by Log4Shell. So at least 30% of the organizations out there have not even responded to the biggest, most high-profile issue in our industry after 3 years. The only conclusion from that is that they don't have a good understanding of what's inside their software. So, the software bill of materials by itself doesn't solve a lot of problems, but the act of being able to produce it accurately sets you up to have that inventory across your organization so that you can respond to the next problem. And of course, for all the reasons I outlined earlier, you're going to be required to do it. But merely just going through the act of producing a piece of paper and shipping it does not get you, the organization, the benefits that you will need to respond to the next incident. Right. So that's where you need to start. If you can't already very quickly find out if your organization is using anywhere in the portfolio a given library, then that's where you need to start.
And it's a question really of making sure you know what the known knowns are, don't you?
Yeah,
You
you
know,
have to
and
start there. That's right. Yeah, because if you're not prepared to deal with that, that's kind of like last year's war. We're dealing with
yeah.
an exponentially increasing number of intentionally malicious components. Those things are not going to show up on a bill of materials, just like a poisoned pie doesn't call out poison in the food ingredients. But if you're not prepared to even deal with the obvious things, you're not going to be able to prepare to deal with the latest attacks of malware being introduced through the supply chain.
Yeah, I mean it's a very important point, and I can't stress enough for people to focus in on getting that sort of capability in place, because at least you're starting from a known place going forward. So thank you for that, Brian. And it's not just about what the EO and the executive order and the memo are saying. It's not just about the need to generate evidence to other people. There are other things out there. Andrew, in yourself, can you compare and contrast some of the requirements, for example, for DORA with the requirements for the US for supply chain security, which is driving some of these issues forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, just introducing DORA, getting a level playing field. It's a EU regulation coming into effect January 2025. It has some soft requirements that are in place now as of 2023. It's been worked on for the past several years, and it stands for the Digital Operational Resilience Act. And so the primary function is to oversee security functions of mostly financial entities and third-party service providers. And so here, very closely related to what we're seeing with these executive orders, immediate similarities, establishing just a general risk management system, understanding the risk that lies within the supply chain, the third-party system, having a structured area to be able to report incidents and react to those incidents, mapping those back to the risk that was originally uncovered, being able to create dynamic connections where you can understand the source of these risks, where they're occurring, the impact that they're having, and then continuously building on that where we have resiliency and pen testing requirements. These are similarities across both, as well as just a general understanding and overall management of third parties and fourth and nth parties that might be involved in this practice as well. As we get into differences, obviously DORA is mostly targeted towards the financial sector. This is because of a massive number, well over 50% of EU financial institutions facing third-party breaches. More differences, the DORA framework has a fairly structured controls management side to it, where there are individual line items to go attack and implement in the organization to give you better security posture versus these executive orders, referencing to NIST best practices, still connected to a framework, but a little bit more flexibility as to how you should be approaching this per organization. And then really the last core difference, there are many differences, but the last difference I want to highlight is this big requirement for a register of information from DORA. It's going to be an elaborate map of showing all the entities, the relationships, the contracts, functions and services of all of these components, and understanding that chain reaction of where you have a critical moment of failure or a breach, and how that just expands into a greater scenario where you're mapping in additional risks that impact your business. And so to bring all of this together, in summary, in my opinion, there's a lot of learning opportunities from the current DORA initiative, case studies out there, best practices, watching organizations under this, regulatory flame, get their act together as far as how they are reacting and aggregating information. So without, the pressure of immediate regulation, from these executive orders, it's a good opportunity to take a look at your risk management programs internally from an operational standpoint. Get ahead with these updated best practices that are being advised from these executive orders, and just have a better landing spot to be able to track all of this information. And it typically is going to involve some internal process changes to really execute at a broader level that you can expand out into the organization and really make a scalable approach that makes a meaningful impact when it comes back to these, again, operational risks that we're trying to mitigate.
Yeah, and I think it's also both your comment and Brian's comments of the role of SBOMs. I think one of the things that occurs to me is that we're now driving the questions in relation to risk and security that need to be answered in the organization to parts of the organization never had to answer them before, or to the same degree to which they are now being asked. So developers are now involved. The people who are actually mapping out the infrastructures and where things, the architects, where things go, they're needing to answer questions. So I think there is something interesting about the degree to which internally us as risk professionals need to engage deeper and wider within the organization to be asked these questions. So thanks, Dan. That's a really good understanding of what DORA was all about. I think one of the challenges we've got clearly is how we comply with all these requirements. And one of the ways to do that is frame the problem adequately internally by partly knowing who we've got to talk to. So Charlie, from your perspective, as an organization, most organizations are often overwhelmed by the number of security issues and vulnerabilities that they identify when analyzing third-party software. How do you suggest our audience more efficiently manage and prioritize the issues found during their own internal testing and evaluation?
It's a good question. I think the feeling of being overwhelmed is absolutely a shared sentiment that I often hear from a large portion of the security industry, especially when they start kind of opening this, what I refer to as the black box of commercial software, as you said, for the very first time. The volume of software that large enterprises rely on today is enormous, right? It's software underpins every single business process. I actually just talked to an AppSec professional of a kind of very large, kind of global 30,000 plus employee organization, and they were estimating that I think it was 15,000 unique apps that they had within their kind of deployed within their production environment. And they thought the real number was actually closer to 50,000 unique applications. And that included kind of software downloaded through non-approved and non-sanctioned channels. And so the lesson, at least I learned from that, was just like the volume of applications is far too high to oversee with manual methods. So some fundamental ways of getting around that is going back to the basics, right? Using a risk-based approach, focusing on those applications that are most critical to your business, tying them to important business services, and then more importantly, leveraging automation wherever possible. And when it comes to vulnerabilities specifically, look, you're always going to find vulnerabilities in software. When people start testing for the first time, you'll find hundreds of them. Like Brian said, you're still finding Log4j, one of the most critical celebrity vulnerabilities in the last couple of years, pervasively across the environment, across your networks. So my advice is always start by targeting those that are most likely to materialize into actual business impact and attacks. So vulnerabilities which have a known exploit instead of those that are just discovered and hypothetical in nature. Those that are where there's evidence of them being actively exploited in the wild. The SysAkev, the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, is a great source for that. And then finally, where you get more mature, where is there evidence that there's malware that's actually been crafted to specifically take advantage of that vulnerability, which makes the skill set and effort to take advantage of it kind of much lower, much easier to take advantage of at scale. So to me, it's all about prioritization, focusing on what's fixable and what presents the most risk to your business.
Yeah, it's the strategy I've been following with my own clients. Criticality, exploitability are the key issues you've got to focus in on. You know, and some of the vulnerabilities you find these days, you have to focus in on those ones because the rest are just not going to be fixed by anyone anyway. There's dependencies, you know.
And it would seem negligent at some point. Brian was talking about Log4j. I had this flashback. I used to do purple teaming at PwC, where you do ethical hacking exercises, and we'd always find things like MS-1710, the WannaCry vulnerability.
Yeah,
6 years after it's been published and have patches out to fix it. So it's sort of reminiscent of that, where you find these, you escalate them. It's kind of hard not to fix once you know about them. The issue is, to Brian's point, people haven't known about them because they haven't been generating SBOMs.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Steve, for that, Charlie. It's not just about the sort of applications that Charlie's mentioned, as we gathered from Paul, there's a whole raft of other software embedded in our systems, isn't there, Paul? So what are the challenges associated with knowing when a third-party piece of firmware or software component itself requires an update? I mean, it's okay, you know, we can go up to look at the websites out there to see what the latest versions are if necessary. Microsoft might even tell us. But what about the firmware? Where do we get that information from?
Yeah, it's interesting when we think about when most users are using a browser, like any of them today, there's an auto update component. Major operating systems, especially Windows, and I'm not really picking on it, but it's very vocal when it needs an update. You get the little notification, and sometimes you can't get out of doing the update, and it's forcing you to do that. When it comes to the components that make up your computer, there's very few facilities for that. It doesn't typically tell you that your firmware needs to be updated. Now, there are some, tools available to do that. Some come from the individual OEMs, but they're very specific to that vendor's component, not all of the 40 plus components that, make up our computers that we're all sitting in front of today. So that presents a challenge, just knowing what version you're running and if it needs an update. In any one given component, it can be pretty simple, but you've got lots of components that you have to match up versions. So I'll give you an example. There was some great research that was presented at Black Hat. It was called Sync Close. I believe researchers from IOActive presented on specific vulnerabilities in AMD processors. Now, it took me quite some time to figure out what version of an AMD processor and specifically like their firmware I was running, and go back to their advisory and compare that to what the fixed version was. And then it turns out I don't have an update yet because the OEM, Asus in my case, has to produce a firmware update, a BIOS update for me to remediate that vulnerability. And the tooling to do that on, at least on Linux as an example, is not great. To like get that version of that specific thing from AMD is not great. So I think it's a matter of the tooling not telling you there's an update, and then figuring out if you need an update to remediate any supply chain vulnerabilities or just regular vulnerabilities in there is difficult, challenging.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Paul. We're going to have first poll of the day. Some of you have already answering it already, so I'm very grateful for that. Just remind everyone in the audience, these polls are important because they help us frame the questions and help frame our discussion and conversation this afternoon. We always welcome feedback from our audience in relationship to issues that give some story points that our panelists can hang their points they're making on. And the first one is all about navigating the complexities of software supply chain compliance. So why consider the issue? We need to remind ourselves that what risks are present if we're not compliant, and see if there are strategies we can adopt that work elsewhere. So, Brian, from your perspective, you mentioned critical nature of various standards like PCI DSS 4.0. What are some of the potential risks of not meeting compliance against these standards? And what innovative approaches or solutions in particularly have you seen work effectively for organizations to manage their compliance?
Yeah, so I suspect anybody here working with PCI standards probably knows, maybe even better than me, what the risks are. But we're looking at fines from the credit card companies should a breach occur. These fines can be tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars a month, depending on the number of cards being processed or the size of the breach. It could result in, loss of the ability to take credit card payments, which could be, game ending for certain organizations. You might end up having to pay for a PCI audit that also could cost tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars to go figure out what the actual root cause of the breach was. And so the standards themselves can come with some pretty significant, fines. I think the other aspect of this, that as these standards, not just PCI, but all of them become more generally accepted, I think it starts to lay the basis for what liability regimes might consider, reasonable due care. If every standard basically says you need to have a bill of materials and you need to track what your dependencies are, and you're not doing it, that should be a pretty easy case to be made, in some kind of lawsuit, that you were failing to take a reasonable series of steps to avoid gross negligence, types of terms. This in the wake of CrowdStrike and, Delta and back and forth has become another topic of late. And so I think, I would encourage people to not only focus on what the letter of the particular standards apply to, but the fact that every standard is now requiring this raises that bar to become a generally accepted minimum standard, and failing to meet that could have significant legal liability types of consequences.
Well, that's how we establish industry best practices, isn't it? But because we all say it's the right thing to do, so everyone jumps on the bandwagon to do it.
That's
so
right.
What sort of approaches have you seen your clients follow to try and get up to that bar?
Yeah, I mean, historically, our customers have been sort of early adopters to these types of things, wanting to understand what their dependencies are, because they recognize that it's not just a tax, it actually makes them more efficient. The research has shown time and time again that organizations doing this are, at least 30% more innovative. And you think about that for a minute. Why is that? It's because, organizations didn't get to just skip log4shell. They still had to deal with it. If they weren't prepared, the cost of doing that was significantly higher than somebody who already had a process in place to deal with this.
Yeah.
And so we've done lots of studies. We have an annual State of the Software Supply Chain report, 10th annual one's coming out in a couple months. We found that this is a case where you can have your cake and eat it too, that organizations that focus on solving this problem like a supply chain, thinking about it at scale, are both more secure and faster than organizations that care about only being secure or going fast. Because like I said before, you didn't get to skip log4j just because, you weren't focused on security. You still had to deal with it. But organizations that only cared about security usually are set up not to be able to respond quickly. And that's important too, when these things happen, that having a process that works at scale allows you to actually turn around these fixes much more quickly. Than organizations who said the only thing we care about is being secure, right? So when done properly, this is not a tax. It actually makes the organization more effective and, avoids all the things that I started with the opening to this question. So that's how we're seeing people really deal with this.
Brilliant. The answers to the poll are in there. Not surprisingly, because you added the words PCI DSS into it. A third of the people are most concerned about the complexities of that. And I am, having been part of the responsibility for PCI in the past and PCI DSS, so I understand the concerns. I think sometimes they're a little bit overstated than what people would actually understand them to be. But does this reflect your own understanding of your clients' concerns out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the industry, of course. If you
Yeah.
don't deal with credit cards, then it's not PCI. But like I laid out, basically everybody has a hook. Some organizations may not realize it yet, and they might be behind the curve of dealing with this. So yeah, this tends to track. The other aspect of this that we see time and time again is that leaders tend to overemphasize or overestimate how effective they actually are at solving this problem. They may be using outdated tools that solve, last decade's problem and don't understand the more complex nature of today's modern software supply chain. And so when we do our studies every year, the survey data indicates organizations are doing a great job, but then you go and analyze those exact applications they're producing and prove no, actually, in many cases, they're doing a below average job. And so there's a huge knowledge gap in what's actually happening versus what the leaders think are happening. And that's a train wreck ready to happen because of all the things we just talked about. If the people who are going to be responsible for these fines and the liability and all of this stuff think they're doing a better job than they are, they're not worried enough. And that's what we see time and time again.
I would hold that thought on my estimation, because that's what we're going to talk about in a moment. So we're going on to the next poll of the day, which is asking you, the audience, how confident you are in your own organization's ability to mitigate these risks across the software supply chain. So we might get a take on that now. So
I didn't read it, and I might have.
Nice little placeholder there, Right, so thanks for introducing it nicely for me. So while you're answering that, well, let's talk about supply chain compliance. Supply chain compliance is just one part of third-party risk management, but it's clearly a more nuanced issue than just normal third-party risk management. So Andrew, what are some of the effective techniques that you come up with or you're aware of to mitigate this third-party risk as software suppliers are onboarded?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first component to really properly addressing this question is understanding the risk. And so here we're form fitting a life cycle depending on the use case of that particular software or that particular supplier, understanding the inherent risk with that supplier, and then we can form fit our reaction to that risk. And this is going to create operational efficiencies where we can now spend time on the areas of more concern than just kind of going through a more robotic process. And so speaking to specific techniques, proper intake of information at that first level, as you understand, how the software is going to be used, how the interaction with the supplier is going to take place, the data that might be going back and forth between you and a third party or you and a supplier can really dictate how you should be onboarding that particular type of supplier. And so I always use a silly example with my customers talking about the different types of suppliers they could be dealing with. We're talking about a large group where it could consist of tactical or not tactical, but operational suppliers for on-site locations, such as a coffee provider for an on-site cafeteria. This is still a supplier, and it aligns with the supplier that's also giving a secure cloud hosting type provider to my organization. So these are two critically different processes that I can use to onboard a vendor, where I might want to get more in the weeds with obviously the situation that has more risk associated to it. And so we can start to uncover that risk as we gather insights about a particular relationship, the details of that relationship, how it's going to be leveraged within the organization, to then proceed forward with the controls, the areas that we can use to mitigate the amount of risk that we might be taking with working with that certain supplier. The next step typically in this process is, again, screening the suppliers that we're going to be working with. So using external sources, again, just routing in that data and having a comprehensive view to have a reaction to the appropriate risks that are uncovered in the areas that we might want to focus on with this particular relationship. From there, launching a dynamic type of assessment. One assessment for all suppliers is not suitable. There's no single assessment that can really dive into the appropriate detail for how you are going to be reacting and just interacting with that particular vendor. And so having a more dynamic approach where we can get into the weeds of certain elements when we uncover this area of risk makes it a lot more feasible to attack the risks and initiate compliance around that risk after we uncover it with a more tailored questionnaire directly to the vendor. And then,
I think that's really important, having the tailored questionnaires for the vendors. Some of the generic questionnaires really don't work, particularly with the nuances supplied for that side of things. So I absolutely agree with you there. The answers to your poll are in. Nearly half the audience are somewhat confident that they have strategies for mitigating risk across the software supply chain. That sounds to me like people like sitting on the fence a little bit. What's your take on the response?
Yeah, well, I'm glad that it's a little surprising to me. I would see more on the neutral side, but it's great that people are already in this mindset of understanding the risk across their supplier supply chain or software supply chain, just implementing more best practices, I think, to really get a hold on, where that risk occurs, how it can impact the organization, and then looking ahead, there's going to be increasing regulation around these areas. It's not going to decrease, certainly. And so just making sure we have appropriate practices to understand the risk and appropriately react to it from a compliance perspective should make a really great impact on general business operation and just understanding how we can create a more trustworthy environment with all of the suppliers that we might be interacting with.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed for that, Andrew. We're going on to our third poll of the day. So I look forward to seeing the answers to that. This one is all about which of the following controls you believe is the obligation of an enterprise rather than the publisher to implement. I'm looking forward to discussing that with you in a moment. While you do so, I think one of the biggest challenges everyone's working with when they're talking about the software they're using within their own organizations, or perhaps even the dependencies they've got coming down, is the various flavors and variants that are available out there. So, Charlie, if the common question I hear about here is that the software vendor issues so many different versions of the same package, both online, offline versions, cloud hosted, etc. How does one know which of these one should be testing to ensure adequately address the risks? That's a real challenge, isn't it?
Yep. Sorry, as I come off mute, I literally just got this question from a customer yesterday, so very timely. Producers of commercial software, these vendors, often will give you, as you said, a number of kind of options for downloading their package. And the most popular of which is called what we refer to as like an online installer. You can think of it as kind of like a stub of the larger commercial package that when you install it, it will connect to the internet and download a number of kind of new components and dependencies which the software requires to operate. And those are ultimately preferred by vendors because they're so easy to distribute and maintain because they're so small and agile. Now, the issue that those stubs present is that they aren't complete packages, and they don't include kind of all the third-party libraries that are retroactively downloaded during the installation process. So they don't tell you the full story. So I always advise when testing, try to gain access to what we call the offline installer, which is a different variant, as you said, that includes all those components and dependencies within a single package. That's going to ensure kind of greater completeness during testing, which, of course, I'm sure this GRC audience will appreciate is a key characteristic that any auditor, any regulator will look for when they're evaluating kind of testing evidence of control effectiveness of your application security program within your business.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. The answers are in. Which is your particular, where would you place the emphasis? It's your question, your poll. Where would you have placed the emphasis on the answer?
Yeah, I think this is actually really interesting and actually deviates from some industry expectations, and I'll explain why. So there's this new framework that's been published, relatively new, let's say the last year. It's a software supply chain security framework known as the Enduring Security Framework. It's established, for those who aren't familiar, a group or a panel of U.S. agencies. I'll call it CISA, NSA, and ODNI. They had this three-part series for software developers, for software suppliers, which are essentially VARs, resellers, and software customers. And one of the reasons I like this framework is it essentially defines this division of responsibilities between the three groups and the way they frame that is they talk about the threat scenarios that they're susceptible to and the corresponding controls that they would expect that persona has deployed in their environment. And when you look at those threat scenarios and controls expected of those parties, malware, vulnerabilities, and kind of malicious software tampering, which we included in the base of the question, those are expected by both parties here, publishers and buyers. Now, it's really interesting because the rest of the capabilities, sensitive information leakage, software compliance, license compliance, application hardening, none of those are called out as an obligation of the buyer explicitly. They're entirely omitted from the threats that they're exposed to and the controls that they would expect to have. And that's, of course, you can make the argument that there are probably some indirect scenarios where a control fails at a vendor and that there's some downstream impact to a customer, but you can't monitor everything. And so it's really interesting that essentially, I don't think this poll aligns with the expectations of the industry. Essentially, you have no one or very little saying none of the above. And perhaps that can actually serve as a realization that people are maybe overextending your control obligations and spending time and resources for something you aren't really expected to manage. Things like license compliance would be very difficult for a buyer of software to manage. And it looks like industry is expecting that of the publisher instead.
Yeah, I think part of that is actually how you frame the question. I think all organizations are worried about managing their own compliance to make sure all their licenses are valid. So that's perhaps why people are answering that question. But some interesting thought for you to take back to your discussions on the issues you go forward. So thank you very much indeed for that, Charlie. We're on to our final poll of the day, which is all about where the biggest supply chain threats to your business comes from today. While you're doing and answering that one, we're going to turn to Paul, and we're looking at this issue of embedded code a little bit further. Paul, how does one validate the integrity of this third-party firmware and software components? Do we assume it's okay, or do we have to go out and check it?
Yeah, I highly recommend going around and checking it. And we actually do that. One of those 3 ways that we've integrated into our product, actually, to validate the integrity of firmware. And the first one is matching it with what the manufacturer has produced, right? So you'll get the firmware from the manufacturer. I like to say we kind of like have a hoarding problem. We hoard a lot of firmware. Millions of samples of code exist in our database as known good samples that we can then compare to what is actually running on the system and alert if there's a match or mismatch, I should say. The second thing is to take a baseline of actually what's running on the system. So, agent runs, pulls a baseline of all the firmware and bootloaders on your system, not just firmware, but software as well. Some software, I should say, and then takes a snapshot and alerts on any changes. And the reason I really like the baselining is because, as we all know, oftentimes a computer manufacturer or a vendor of some component will end of life that component and end support for it and not produce any new software. So I have laptops, right, that are perfectly fine laptops, but my UEFI is not going to get an update because it's end of life. So what I do is I create a baseline, and if that changes, well, there's no legitimate way, that should change. There's no reason why, because the vendor's never going to release an update. If it changes, it could be an evidence of tampering.
Malicious, yeah.
Yeah, and I do the same thing with bootloaders as well, which is, an attacker's target today, as we saw with Black Lotus, which I can talk more about. But the third way is by looking for vulnerabilities, zero-day vulnerabilities, and disassembling and decompiling the components within firmware. We built a system called Automata that uses several different processes, some of the ones I just described, to look at specifically today we're focused on UEFI and branching out into other types of firmware as well. And we've discovered a few different vulnerabilities, some of which have been released and some of which, as a teaser, will be releasing in the future, and it has discovered these vulnerabilities in UEFI.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for you did that. Guys, Paul, what's your take on the response? Is the biggest risk what the audience say, which is third-party software, or would you put it lower down the list?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with the third-party software, being the risk to the supply chain, right? And that comes in different shapes and forms. I'm a big fan of trying to protect the things you didn't choose, right? Because a lot of other software, we get to choose and we got better visibility into that software. And sometimes the lower you go in the OS, the less visibility and less choice you have as to what's on your system.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that. We'll look to the future now. Brian, I'd like to turn to yourself. What do you think some of the key challenges and opportunities are as we move forward, particularly in relationship to the adoption of frameworks like NIST, the adoption of SBOMs, etc., and how we should prepare for that?
Yeah, I think a lot of the things we've covered kind of highlight those challenges. If you don't have good visibility into your first-party software, you're going to be unable to meet these upcoming standards. For parts of the stack that you're building upon that you acquire elsewhere, if they don't have good visibility, you're going to have a hard time complying as well, because you need to, bundle up all of that in your complete packaged SBOM. Another challenge in the short term is going to be validating that the SBOMs that you receive are in fact accurate. Right now, I wouldn't trust at face value most of the SBOMs I receive, just because of what I see in the industry. And so having tooling and ways to kind of trust but verify is going to be very important in the short term. Over the long term, hopefully, the regulations will take care of themselves, and you should be able to trust what you're getting. But in the next 5 years, I think that's going to be a struggle. So that's going to be an issue, and this comes up in areas like when you have to fill out the CISA attestation form. One of the things you're attesting to is not only that you're following the standards for your software, but also that you've done due diligence on all of the open source and third-party dependencies that come along with it. Right. And that's where, collecting those SBOMs for the rest of your stack is really going to become a key. And doing, I think the words are good business faith efforts, will probably include things like, you've actually checked to make sure that they're at least reasonably accurate to the best of your ability, those types of things.
Well, I mean, to me, I think one of the important capabilities is many of the software composition and analysis tools are building in capabilities to generate SBOMs from the raw data. It's not something you got to do manually, which is at least a really strong starting point. I think that's a very favorable step forward.
Yeah, that's right. If you have SCA or your vendors have SCA, then the SBOMs are probably pretty accurate. But I see a lot of people trying to hand roll them right now, or they have SCA tools that are not very accurate. Not doing the binary analysis is going to have problems. There are many SCA tools out there. None of the ones here are those, it sounds like. Just read the manifest. So in other words, they're just trusting what the build tool says, which is very different than what might actually end up in the final product. It can be incomplete. It can be inaccurate. All these kinds of things would lead to the SBOM being, not trustworthy. So.
Thank you for that, Brian. I think we've got to recognize that some of the vulnerabilities we've had over the recent years impact multiple companies, many of which represent concentration risk, don't they, Andrew? So how do we discover these unknown concentration risks within our software supply chain?
Yeah, absolutely. This can be quite the rabbit hole of a question, but I'll do my best to simplify here. I think there's two key aspects. Understanding what concentration risk is, and then specifically identifying that unknown portion, which is notoriously difficult to do. So the concentration risk is really that type of risk that occurs when a company relies too heavily on a single supplier to conduct their day-to-day business. So a very heavily centered risk around the business. And so there's a couple ways to address this. One would be understanding where the risk is within the organization and how heavy that risk is when it's mapped to operational objectives. The second piece is going to be fourth party mapping. So there can also be concentration risk when I interact with multiple different suppliers, and all of those suppliers are also using one software to conduct their business. So it's a fourth party concentration risk. And so these commonalities between the third parties are now extrapolated out, and it becomes more difficult to understand that. And so the way that we approach it is asking detailed questions about how a software provider might be leveraging their tools within their tech stack and mapping that up with all of the suppliers that you use on a third-party basis, and then understanding where there might be critical applications where, if they go down, I might have three of my third parties, also out of business as far as being able to support me in my operations. And so establishing, backup mechanisms, prioritizing concentration risk, and attacking it where it makes the most impact can really make a significant difference as far as reacting to that risk and understanding, again, how it's going to impact the organization.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Andrew. Very wise observations there. One of the issues when we're playing around with this code is, do we have permission to do it? So Charlie, from yours, can we have a quick answer on, do we need to get explicit approval from the software suppliers when we do things to their code to test it?
Yeah, it's a tough question. You'll see the prior consultant in me emerge as I answer. It depends. I think that the decision to analyze third-party software is ultimately up to the discretion of the company. That being said, there are industry working groups that are led by CISA. For example, there's one, I believe it's called On-Ramps and Adoption, that anyone can join. It's publicly open. But they have guidance that essentially they've advised procuring organizations that they should enforce certain contractual terms and conditions, which would enable the right to perform what they call self-assessments of third-party software. And they even go as far as saying you should ensure you include the right to perform reverse engineering, which I think is a little overkill and will likely get redlined. But many customers rely on terms like that, embedding them in MSAs to ensure they can use a number of technologies, right? Antivirus, sandboxes, vulnerability scanning, endpoint detection, all these tools that are already constantly scanning your third-party software. So I'd say it depends. It depends on your organization's risk appetite, but it's probably worth noting that you're already likely scanning these or analyzing these packages in some way, even if you're not aware of it.
Thank you very much indeed, Charlie. Paul, the last word on is really for you. Before we go into the quick final tips we leave people with, can you say just a few words about any recent examples of malicious actors taking advantage of supply chain and third-party risk?
Yeah, two examples come to mind. One is the Black Lotus boot kit that is kind of like a bring your own vulnerable bootloader style attack, very similar to the downgrade attacks that were presented at Black Hat last week. The other is Chinese threat actors actually leveraged a local privilege escalation exploit on a Cisco NX OS device. And it wasn't privilege escalation. They were able to pivot from like the Cisco management plane and interface into the underlying Linux system, and that was observed in the wild. So patch your local privilege escalation stuff because attackers go after it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Steve. Well, so can I thank the panelists? It's been a really engaging conversation. I wish we could have gone for longer. We had so many more questions that we could have got through and asked and answered, because this is a really important topic. So thanks for your participation. It was really engaging. We now give the opportunity for them all to give their takeaways and what they would like to leave you, the audience, with as you leave the conversation. So Paul, you kick off first. What would be your takeaway for this evening's conversation?
Sure. Make sure you incorporate in your vulnerability management and patching programs the things that we highlighted that kind of live in the shadows and below the surface as it is. Your network appliances, your components and firmware. Incorporate those into your programs. Right. Identify those in your environment. Fix the issues that are there. And collect data so you can detect and respond if there is an attack in some of these areas that oftentimes with network appliances and firmware and BIOS have very low visibility.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Paul. Charlie, over to you for your takeaway.
I think you actually saw it on a slide. I believe it was Brian that presented it, that summarized it very well. I think that presented all these situations that may require an SBOM. I think it drives home the point that gaining visibility and control over the software supply chain is no longer optional. It's firmly ingrained in kind of legislation, regulation, and now kind of, as we just talked about, third-party contract templates. And that's not only for publishers, but for buyers of software as well. So it's important to think about how are you going to provide demonstratable evidence to an auditor, to a regulator, to a third party that you know what's in your software, and more importantly, you know whether it presents risk to your business or your customers, irregardless of whether you built it or bought it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Charlie. Andrew, your takeaway this evening.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one, is great to be here. My takeaway is just overall understanding your operational environment, internal and external perspectives, creating dynamic processes to understand the risk that you need to react to, having proper protocols and controls, methodologies in place to get in front of that risk and mitigate it as much as we can, and just really creating an environment that enables you to take action instead of be subject of one of these events. Being able to get in front of it, understand it, and properly mitigate it with an appropriate system, I think is a key takeaway.
Thanks very much indeed, Andrew. And Brian, over to you for your final takeaway for this afternoon's conversation.
Yeah, so Forrester has listed Sonatype as the leader of their most recent software composition analysis. You can see here the so-called NASCAR slide of all of the industries and companies that trust us to help protect their supply chain. If you want to know more about the things I've been talking about, we have that State of the Software Supply Chain report, sonatype.com/SSC. You can find the latest there. That's it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Brian. And thank you, everyone. And once again, it was a really good conversation. I'd like to hand back to Kelly to close us out. Kelly.
All right. Thank you, Colin. And thank you again, panelists, for a great discussion. I know our audience appreciates all of the information. Join us again next month for a strategic approach to meeting PCI requirements in a cloud-driven world. You can reserve your seat now through the console, but before you do that, please do take a moment to leave us a rating and feedback for today's session. We value feedback, and it helps us to plan for future events. So that's it for today. I'd like to thank our speakers for your participation, with a special thanks to our sponsors, without whom this event would not be possible. And of course, thanks again for listening. Please stay tuned for upcoming programs, and we'll see you next time.